My name is Peter, and first of all, thank you, Shri Dr. Jaishankar, for coming to Sweden. And it's such a great pleasure to have, a foreign minister from such a big country like India here. So my question is that since India is already the most populous country in the world, it was probably have the highest GDP in the world and surpassing countries such as USA and much of the West. So my question to you is, do you think also that the Indian culture will become more prominent in the West? That, for example, in the future, when we think of fast food, we think of pani puri instead of hamburger. That radios here would start to play Bollywood music, and that H&M t-shirts would have New Delhi printed on instead of New York. Thank you, sir.
Let me start with the UN Security Council question. The UN, I think everybody will remember, was designed in the 1940s at a time when, though India was an original signatory to the Charter, but India was not an independent country. And at that time, the 5 countries who are still today permanent members of the Security Council, they kind of selected themselves, you could say. Now, the problem today is, like any institution, those who are previous beneficiaries are resistant to that change, which they feel would in some way dilute their positions of privilege. Now, some of them may be more so, some of them less so. I think the wiser ones will say, okay, life is changing, let me change with it. It's useful for us to have a country like India. There would be others who may not oppose us openly, but effectively through their actions and policy ensure that the status quo is maintained. For almost now 20 years, there has been a persistent effort to find a way of reforming the UN. And there are today 190 something countries who are members of the UN. Now you would imagine, you can ask yourself, how hard can it be? Okay, if there are 190 countries, why don't they all sit in a room and sit down and thrash it out? But as Ambassador would tell you, he's worked in the United Nations. What happens is, the obstructions and the maneuvers begin. So even sitting in the room to discuss it itself is a challenge, So this, quite honestly, is it's not just a challenge for India, because the fact is, there is today no African country as a permanent member. There is no Latin American country. So what happens is, if you have any large body, it could be a body of nations, body of people, if the leadership, the decision making is not representative of the membership. So it's like a shareholding. If the shareholders of a company feel that the company management is not representative of the shareholding, you're going to have problems. Now, at this time, you can actually see that with each passing year, the effectiveness of the UN has actually come under question. So, even for the good of the UN, it is. So, I'm not even taking an Indian viewpoint. I would say globally, fairness, effectiveness would dictate that there is reform. For the good of the UN, there should be reform. But it will be a kind of a tussle between the reformists and those who are obstructionists. But I'm very confident that, look, with each passing year, I've seen the sentiment for reform grow stronger. So when it will happen, I can't say, but I can say the needle is moving in the direction of reform. That I can certainly accept. Regarding the geopolitical challenge issue, look, how the world looks depends in many ways where you look at it. I can imagine today, I've seen in the last, yesterday, today, the people I met. Here, obviously, right now, the Ukraine conflict is the most important event. It's understandable because it's a very proximate region. Now, if you go, let us say, to Asia or to Latin America, I was there 2 weeks ago, it's not like they are unaware of the seriousness of it. It is that it's manifested in their lives in a very different way. So if you ask, say in Africa today, what is it which is really like you consider the life and death issue? People will tell you, look, debt is a big issue. We don't have the money to do education, health. We are actually cutting back in many ways, far from progressing. We are actually in some ways regressing. There will be places where, even the Ukraine conflict has expressed itself in food shortage. A large part of Africa, Middle East was actually importing food, and their food chains have been disrupted. There are countries who have found that their energy bills have shot up, and in some ways it's become unaffordable for a country. There would be places where actually people will say, fertilizer supply, because remember, Russia is one of the biggest, probably the biggest exporter of fertilizer, that has been affected. So one part of it is we are today in a very globalized existence, and a disruptive event somewhere will actually not just affect that immediate region. That would have happened 25 years ago. Distant parts would not have felt it the way that they are doing today. Now, once you accept that, I would say look at the disruptions across, what could be the source of disruptions. We spoke about COVID. Think how much COVID actually disrupted the world. Not only by the health consequences of COVID, the economic consequences, the mobility consequences, the supply chain consequences. During the lockdown, when we had the lockdown in 2020, one of the regions which was very, very anxious at the time of lockdown was actually the Gulf, because most of us don't readily realize it. Every day, there is food shipment moving out of India to the Gulf. They are heavily dependent on us for actually their food supplies. So they were very worried that actually the flow of food would get disrupted, and we actually made an exceptional effort at that time to ensure that it didn't happen. So one part of it, as I said, is this whole set of disruptive events. It could be pandemic, it could be climate events. Again, we think of global warming, but look at the regularity and the growing intensity of climate events. That climate events are getting stronger, more catastrophic in their consequences, and they will be disruptive as well. You had countries where there are massive floods, enormous heat waves, right? Big cyclones. We're seeing one right now near Bangladesh. And if you measure them against how it happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, no question that they're all getting much more severe. I don't know if you follow Hindi, but there is a term which says "Aapke muh mein ghee shakkar."
So my question to you is: do you think also that the Indian culture will become more prominent in the West? That, for example, in the future, when we think of fast food, we think of pani puri instead of hamburger. That radios here would start to play Bollywood music, and that H&M t-shirts would have New Delhi printed on instead of New York.
I don't know if you follow Hindi, but there is a term which says "Aapke muh mein ghee shakkar." We very sort of welcome in many ways what you say, may it come true. You can be so enthusiastic, I'm sure everybody else will join you in that regard.